On a grey morning in October, a 19-year-old boy stood at the edge of a condemned shipyard, counting the last of his money. $7. 3 coins. A crumpled receipt from a gas station sandwich he'd shared with the only person left in his life. He was about to spend every cent of it on a boat that the harbour authority had listed for scrap. A boat so old, so rusted, so forgotten, that the auctioneer laughed when he read the winning bid out loud. $10. He didn't know it yet, but that laughter would be the last time anyone laughed at Ethan Cole for a very long time. Because sealed behind a rusted door, 3 decks below the waterline, something was waiting. Something that had been locked away for 41 years. Something that would change not just his life, and the life of the girl beside him, but the quiet, forgotten history of an entire town. This is that story. Ethan Cole and Mia Delgado had known each other since they were 14 years old, sitting 3 seats apart in a 9th grade history class in a small coastal town called Port Ashby. Neither of them had a stable home to return to after school. Ethan bounced between a father who worked offshore for months at a time and a string of relatives who never quite had room for one more. MIA's mother struggled with addiction, and by 16, Mia was mostly raising herself. They found each other the way people sometimes do, not through romance at first, but through recognition. 2 kids who understood, without needing to explain it, what it felt like to not have anywhere that was truly theirs. By 19, they were a couple, and they were homeless. Not the kind of homeless that makes headlines. The quiet kind. The kind where you sleep in a car for a few nights, then on a friend's couch, then in a shelter that has a 2-week limit, then back in the car again. The kind where you shower at the gym you can no longer afford a membership to, using a code you memorized before your card stopped working. Ethan worked 2 jobs, dishwashing at a diner in the mornings, and hauling crates at the fish market in the evenings. Mia cleaned motel rooms on the weekends and sold handmade jewelry at a folding table outside the pharmacy. Together, they made just enough to survive, and never quite enough to get ahead. We are not going to be here forever, Ethan. I don't care what it takes. We are going to have 4 walls that are ours. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, everything changed, because of a flyer stapled to a telephone pole outside the fish market. The flyer was faded, half torn by weather, advertising a municipal auction at the old Port Ashby shipyard, a graveyard of derelict boats the harbour authority wanted gone before winter. Scrap dealers usually bought these vessels for their metal. Nobody wanted the boats themselves. They were rusted, gutted, sometimes flooded, sitting in dry dock cradles like skeletons nobody had bothered to bury. Minimum bid, $10. All vessels sold as is. No guarantees. No refunds. $10. He had that much folded in his back pocket, money he'd been saving toward a used mattress. He didn't tell Mia at first. He wasn't even sure why he wanted to go. Maybe it was foolishness. Maybe it was the exhaustion of always renting, always borrowing, always asking. For once, he wanted to own something, even if it was a wreck nobody else wanted. That Saturday, he walked the 2 miles to the shipyard alone. The auction was smaller than Ethan expected. A dozen scrap buyers in work boots, clipboards in hand, eyeing hulls for their steel tonnage. 6 vessels were listed that day. 5 were snapped up quickly by dealers who barely looked twice. The 6th was a 60-foot fishing trawler named the Melly and, built sometime in the 1970s, according to the registry sheet. Her hull was streaked with rust the color of dried blood. Her wheelhouse windows were shattered. Her name was barely legible beneath decades of salt and neglect. Nobody wanted her. The scrap dealers said her steel was too far gone to be worth hauling. The harbour authority just wanted her gone. Last lot of the day, folks. The Melly and minimum bid $10. Do I hear 10? Silence. Ethan raised his hand before he could talk himself out of it. $10. Going once. Going twice. Sold. To the young man in the grey jacket. There was scattered, amused laughter from the scrap buyers. One of them clapped him on the shoulder and told him, not unkindly, that he'd just bought himself a very expensive headache. Ethan didn't care. He signed the paperwork with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, not from cold, but from something closer to disbelief. He owned something. For the first time in his life, something had his name on it. He ran the 2 miles back to the motel parking lot where Mia was waiting, and when he told her what he'd done, she didn't get angry. She started laughing, the real kind, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and startled, and then she started crying, and then she hugged him so hard he nearly fell over. You bought us a boat. Ethan, we are homeless, and you bought us a boat." But underneath the disbelief, something else was stirring in both of them. A boat, even a wrecked one, meant shelter. It meant walls. It meant a roof that didn't belong to a landlord, a shelter director, or anyone else who could ask them to leave. They had no idea it also meant something far bigger was waiting for them below deck. The following morning, Ethan and Mia walked back to the shipyard together, carrying a borrowed flashlight, a crowbar Ethan had found behind the diner's dumpster, and a thermos of coffee they split between them. The Melian sat in her dry dock cradle like something out of a ghost story, tilted slightly, her deck littered with rotted netting, coiled rope gone stiff with rust, and gulls' nests tucked into every crevice. Ethan helped Mia up the makeshift gangway, and together, for the first time, they stepped onto the deck of their new home. The wheelhouse was gutted, dial shattered, charts long since disintegrated into grey pulp. The galley below had a rusted stove, a table bolted to the floor, and a narrow bunk room with 3 sagging beds. It smelled of salt, mildew, and 40 years of silence. It's ours, though. Even like this, it's ours. They spent that first day simply exploring, mapping the boat's layout, dreaming out loud about which corner they'd sleep in, how they might patch the broken windows before the cold came. It was Ethan, running his hand along the corridor wall near the engine room, who found something the auction paperwork hadn't mentioned. A door. Steel, not wood. Bolted shut, secured by a heavy padlock crusted thick with rust, welded almost seamlessly into the surrounding bulkhead so that unless you were looking for it, you'd assume it was just another panel. There was no record of it in the vessel's registry. No mention in the auction listing. Just a locked door, 3 decks below the waterline, in a boat nobody else had wanted. For 3 days, Ethan and Mia argued about the door. Mia wanted to leave it alone. Something about it unsettled her, the way the padlock looked deliberately hidden, the way the hinges had been reinforced far beyond what a normal storage closet would need. Ethan, meanwhile, couldn't stop thinking about it. In a life where almost nothing had ever belonged to him, the idea that something on his boat was being kept from him gnawed at him constantly. Whatever's behind there, it's ours now too. The whole boat is ours. Every locked door on it. On the 4th night, working by flashlight and the glow of a battery lantern they'd bought secondhand, Ethan finally broke the padlock using the crowbar and sheer stubbornness. The hinges screamed with 4 decades of rust as the door groaned open. Behind, it was a narrow steel stairwell, leading down into a space that wasn't on any diagram of a standard fishing trawler. The air that drifted up was cold, dry, and strangely free of the mildew smell that clung to the rest of the ship, as if the space had been sealed airtight for a very long time. "Ethan, I don't think this is part of the boat. I think somebody built this." They looked at each other for a long moment. Then, together, flashlight beams trembling across the darkness, they climbed down. What they found at the bottom of that stairwell would take investigators, historians, and eventually federal officials nearly a year to fully untangle. But in that first moment, all Ethan and Mia understood was that they were standing in a room that should not have existed. It was roughly the size of a small apartment, lined with steel shelving bolted to the walls. Wooden crates, stenciled with faded lettering, were stacked from floor to ceiling. Some had cracked open with age, spilling their contents onto the floor, bundles of old currency, sealed in plastic long since gone brittle. Ledgers, water-damaged but legible, filled with columns of numbers and dates going back decades. And in the far corner, bolted to the floor, a squat iron safe, its dial frozen with rust. It didn't take long for the pieces to start forming a picture, not of treasure, in the way people imagine treasure, but of history. The Melly and, they would later learn, had not always been an honest fishing boat. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, before stricter maritime enforcement, she had quietly served as a running vessel for a smuggling operation along the coast, moving goods, cash, and documents between ports under the cover of legitimate fishing trips. The operation had collapsed suddenly in 1983, when its organizer vanished. Some records suggested an arrest under a different identity in another state, others suggested he simply disappeared. Either way, the boat had been seized, stripped of anything obviously valuable, and left to rot in dry dock for over 40 years. Nobody who processed the seizure back then had ever found the hidden room. It had been built too well, hidden too carefully, sealed behind a wall that looked, to untrained eyes, like nothing more than part of the hull. Ethan and Mia had unknowingly bought not just a boat, but a sealed time capsule of someone else's secret life. That night, sitting on the floor of the hidden room surrounded by 4 decades of dust and mystery, Ethan and Mia didn't celebrate. They sat in stunned silence, flashlight beams crossing over crates of brittle cash that might not even be legal tender anymore, ledgers that could implicate people long dead or long buried under new names, and a locked safe that neither of them had the courage to touch that night. What do we do, Ethan? This isn't just finding money under a floorboard. This is somebody's whole secret. It would have been easy, tempting, even, for two people who had slept in a car only weeks earlier, to take what they could carry and disappear. Nobody knew the room existed. Nobody would have come looking. But Ethan and Mia made a different choice, one that would define the rest of their story far more than the discovery itself. The next morning, they walked to the Port Ashby police station and reported what they'd found. The report set off a chain of events neither of them expected. Local police called in the county sheriff's office. The county called in state investigators. Within a week, federal agents were involved, because some of the ledgers referenced interstate transactions from an era before certain statutes of limitations had run out, and because unclaimed property of that scale, even decades old, triggers automatic review. For nearly 2 months, the melee and was cordoned off, crawling with investigators in windbreakers, forensic accountants poring over ledgers, and at one point, a retired detective who had worked the original 1983 case and had never stopped wondering what happened to the missing operator. Ethan and Mia were interviewed more times than they could count. They were, technically, still the legal owners of the vessel. The auction had been final, no liens attached, no claims filed in over 40 years. But the contents of the hidden room were a different legal question entirely, one that took months of hearings, a court-appointed asset review, and no small amount of local news coverage to untangle. Those ledgers connected to a decades-old unsolved case involving a missing person, a cold investigation the retired detective had carried with him, quietly, for over half his career. Using details from the hidden room, investigators were finally able to locate the operator, alive, elderly, living under an assumed name 3 states away, and bring long overdue closure to families who had waited decades for answers. And the safe, once professionally opened, contained something Ethan and Mia never expected. Not cash, but deeds. Property titles to 3 small waterfront lots in Port Ashby, purchased under the smuggling operation Shell Company in 1981, never sold, never transferred, sitting unclaimed and accumulating decades of back taxes that, under the specific abandoned property statute the court applied, defaulted to the current documented owner of the vessel where the deeds were discovered, Ethan Cole. It would be easy to end this story there, a fairy tale, homeless couple accidentally becomes property owner. But the truth of what Ethan and Mia gained wasn't really about the lots, though the county eventually helped them settle the back taxes through a hardship program, and though one of those lots would, 2 years later, become the small house they built together with their own hands, board by board, using lumber donated by a contractor who'd read their story in the local paper. The truth is that the months of investigation cost them nearly everything they thought the discovery would give them instantly. They couldn't live aboard the Melly, and during the investigation, the boat was evidence. They went back to shelters, back to Ethan's diner shifts and MIA's motel cleaning, back to sleeping wherever they could, all while carrying a secret so large that most of Port Ashby had no idea why 2 homeless teenagers were suddenly being interviewed by federal agents. When it was finally settled, the money that legally passed to them wasn't a fortune, a modest settlement tied to the abandoned property claims, enough to clear their debts, put a real down payment toward land, and, for the first time in either of their lives, open a savings account that didn't hit zero every month. But what mattered more, they'd say later, wasn't the money. It was the 4 walls. 2 years after buying a $10 wreck at a shipyard auction, Ethan and Mia stood on one of those reclaimed waterfront lots, in a small house they had built themselves, and for the first time since they were 14 years old, neither of them had anywhere else they needed to be. The Melly and herself was eventually released back into Ethan and MIA's possession once the investigation closed. Too far gone to ever fish again, she now sits, restored just enough to be safe, at a small dock near their home, repainted, her name repainted in careful white letters, no longer a forgotten wreck but a quiet monument to the 2 people who refused to walk past a locked door. Ethan still keeps the crowbar he used to break that padlock. It hangs on the wall of their home, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of a moment when 2 19-year-olds with nothing left to lose chose curiosity over fear, and honesty over easy money. Everybody wants to hear about the safe, the ledgers, the deeds. But if you ask me what changed our lives, it wasn't what we found behind that door. It was what we decided to do once we found it. Somewhere along a quiet stretch of coastline, a rusted trawler that once cost $10 now sits proudly at a dock that 2 people, once homeless, now call their own, proof that sometimes, the thing that saves you isn't hidden behind a locked door. It's the choice you make once you finally open it.